So could you kindly, panel, introduce yourselves, not at length, and also perhaps your theme for the evening. If we left without hearing you say X, you'd be disappointed, and so would we.
I've got so many things to say.
Let's start with your name.
My name is Mehdi Hassan. I'm the senior editor for politics at the New Statesman magazine. Three things come to mind as we approach the anniversary of 9/11. One is, looking back at the last 10 years, there have been countless newspaper articles every day, what a massive, massive mistake the whole thing was in terms of the war on terror, our reaction, our overreaction, our hysterical and excessive response. It depresses me today to look back in the last 10 years and to actually think there was another way, there were several other ways, and we went the wrong way. A quick second and third point would be, one is, I actually think when we look at terrorism right now, and I wrote a piece about this last week, let me plug a piece I wrote, but how the fact that we actually, the whole terror industry, the whole fear industry is now so much out of control. We spend our lives living in fear when there is so little to fear, in particular terrorism. And my third point would be, I'm a Muslim, so not just as a journalist, but as a Muslim, the last 10 years have been pretty damn depressing to see what's happened to the representation and the treatment of my faith and my fellow Muslims.
Okay. My name's Isabel Hilton. I'm a journalist. I edit China Dialogue and write columns and things. I don't disagree with anything that has just been said. I suppose my kind of 2 points were that, yes, it made us all look in the wrong direction, that the damage we did to ourselves was far greater than the damage that was done on the day itself. And that as an investment in the future, spending $2 trillion on making two futile wars of choice is not a great decision.
My name is Khan Ross. I'm a former British diplomat. I now run a non-profit diplomatic advisory group called Independent Diplomat, which advises various countries and governments and political groups around the world on their diplomacy. I've only got one idea, one point, and that is that the way states reacted to terrorism was a category error. Terrorism is a stateless phenomenon, and states reacted to it by trying to reorder the world dominated by states. They invaded two other states, Afghanistan and Iraq. They collaborated with other states regardless of whether they were democratic or rights respecting. They recognized their own kind, states recognized states. And they tried to reorder the world as a chessboard when in fact it is a Jackson Pollock painting. And that effort has been an extraordinary failure, and I think that conceptual error at the heart of it has been the explanation for that failure. And it also provides the answer for how we deal with terrorism and other stateless phenomena in the future, which is through stateless means, and actually through individual and community and collaborative action, including internationally, by us ourselves. And this is in fact the topic of my book, which is published this week, which is why I'm in England, because I live in New York, called The Leaderless Revolution: How Ordinary People Can Take Power and Change Politics in the 21st Century.
If you mention it again, there'll be trouble.
Let's get the publisher and the price.
Yes.
Martin.
Majid Nawaz, my life is probably best described as a journey on a micro level that can be compared to the Arab Spring on a macro level. What I mean by that is I spent 13 years, a large part of the last 10 years, the decade since 9/11, inside an Islamist organization. I've been a prisoner, a political prisoner in Egypt, subjected to torture, adopted by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience, and went through a journey whereby I then denounced the ideology that I once espoused and co-founded the world's first, we'd like to bill it as the world's first counter-extremism think tank, and now work to challenge the extremisms in the plural through civil society engagement. In terms of my observations on the last 10 years, I'd like to make 3 points. First of all, I'd like to say that I agree with Mahdi that the reaction of America after 9/11 was an overreaction. And as I tried to elaborate in my recent TED speech, I believe they got it upside down. What I mean by that is that the focus should have been on empowering civil society and democratic culture on the ground and propagating a certain set of values, respect for difference and individual liberty, rather than going in with a supply-led approach and trying to impose democracy at the barrel of the gun. The second thing I'd like to say is that, of course, certain values that we all believe in, human rights and the rule of law, were undermined, not least by rendition to torture. And I've been a survivor of that, so it's something that's close to my heart, and also invasion of countries without authorization, and finally detention without charge. In some cases, like in Guantanamo, for over 10 years. So I think that many mistakes were made. I would finally conclude by saying that I do believe that the debate was polarized for much of the last 10 years between the right wing, in many cases, who were keen to overstate the problem and in many cases blame Islam and Muslims for the problem, and those on the left, and I know I'm caricaturing, so forgive me for the sake of generalization so that we can get to the discussion, those on the left who would prefer to bury their heads in the sand and blame everything on foreign policy rather than own up to the fact that there is a genuine problem that needs to be addressed.
And I'm Michael Goldfarb. Today I am the London correspondent of globalpost.com, which is a new news website which was founded to address the ridiculous lack of knowledge of foreign news amongst Americans. 10 years ago, because most of the foreign desks have been shut down in this last 10 years, 10 years ago I was, by chance, on the air presenting a program in Boston, because my job was making long-form radio documentaries and presenting programs back in America, when the Twin Towers were attacked. And I went from scheduled to interview Jack Welch, who at the time was head of GE, and very quickly had become an expert in terrorism, with people whose names I didn't know when they were ushered into the studio. Subsequently to that, I spent most of the next 3 or 4 years investigating the life that Majid was living, although I didn't actually meet him, reporting on radical Islam from Cairo to Tehran to outside my front door in London. What I would like you all to take away from this is that one of the things I said in an interview with the World Service on September 11th, 2001 was, this changes everything. And what I meant, speaking as an American, not as a journalist, was you could feel that this was going to be an event that would bring forth a unilateral response. And that's all I meant. I didn't realize how much else would be changed in America. And I'd like you all to take away just the question, did America change because of September 11th? Or had America already changed? And in a sense, Osama knocked over a rock, and all the grubs and crawly life were revealed by his action.
Thank you all very much. Could we have some lights on the audience? Could I ask everyone here, including the panel, on the day, on 9/11 10 years ago, would you raise your hand if you knew there was going to be war? Would you be honest with yourself and say you knew? Would you keep your hand up if you felt that there was the right war? Right, now that's how we're going to begin the discussion, and I think. Can I ask anyone on the subject of the day, is there anything else before we move on to the decade? We should pay tribute perhaps to the victims. And is there anyone here, I believe there was a panel member who was injured on the day. Is she here? Maybe you'd like to just, I was there on the day, but we're going to discuss the decade. Will you answer those questions into the microphone about what you thought would happen and what happened to you?
My neighbourhood was the World Trade Centre. I worked at 7 World Trade. I lived across the street from South Tower on West Street. I was in my apartment that morning. I'd been for a run. It was a beautiful day, and I saw the second plane coming and hit the tower. And the blast wave knocked me across my apartment into a pillar, fractured my back, my sternum, and broke some ribs.
Thank you for
I
telling
thought
us.
the world was coming to an end that day.
Sorry to interrupt you, and the question that the audience has just answered with their hands, would you answer that with your mouth?
I thought that it was an act of terrorism. I had had some prior knowledge to threats with Al-Qaeda that the Americans didn't seem to realise were going on out in the far Middle East. And when I heard about another plane missing, I thought, this is big.
Did you think there'd be war?
With the president that the States had then, yes.
And thank you very much. So to get the discussion going, the panel said there's been many mistakes. Can I ask, is there anyone in the audience who'd like to have a discussion with the panel on this? The war on terror has prevented another 9/11, has taken out Osama bin Laden and his deputy, has weakened Al-Qaeda. it's argued. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to have that point raised now, and who believes that, and can discuss it with the panel, who've told us there are mistakes? If you catch my eye, I'll put that to the panel ourselves. Maybe starting with you. Al-Qaeda has been weakened, Osama has been killed, the war on terror may not be pleasant, but neither was the act itself. We responded as the West, and we've had victories, not 100%, but we've had victories along the way.
Which depends what we define as those victories along the way. I mean, killing bin Laden is a victory, and if you define killing bin Laden as what you want to do and the right thing to do, then it's a victory. If you look over the last 10 years, no, we haven't achieved victory. In Afghanistan, we were told that the Taliban were done. We'd defeated the Taliban, George Bush said. They're still there. We're now negotiating with the Taliban. We emboldened Al-Qaeda by invading Iraq and giving bin Laden what he had dreamed of, a kind of another Muslim land battleground against infidel crusaders. We created hundreds and hundreds of new terrorists through our actions. And the only reason Al-Qaeda is doing badly now, and there's a debate about that, but the only reason Al-Qaeda seem to be marginalised is A, because they messed up themselves in places like Iraq by killing so many innocent Muslims that the Muslims themselves turned against them, and because of the Arab Spring, where people in the Middle East rose up and showed actually they're not interested in Al-Qaeda's agenda, they're interested in democracy and freedom. It had nothing to do with George Bush's bombs.
Khan, did you support Operation Enduring Freedom, which was what it was called when we went in 2001? The Taliban, a bunch of woman-hating despots, wouldn't give up Osama, and we bombed them.
That's not true, by the way.
Did you support them?
Absolutely. I delivered the letter to the UN where the UK claimed justification for the war under Article 51, self-defence, Article 51 of the UN Charter. I believed it was absolutely the right thing to do. I helped negotiate the resolution that set up the International Security Force in Afghanistan. I served in Afghanistan shortly after the invasion. But I've come to think that the invasion was grossly mistaken. We created a fantasy of Afghanistan, and we sought the information to justify that fantasy rather than seeing the reality, which was that we had not occupied the south, and we had essentially joined a civil war on one side. So the civil war is continuing.
Forgive me, it's a large topic, but in terms of the decade, you began one way and you quickly changed your view.
Not quickly. It took 10 years. No. I mean, I really believed it. I thought the invasion of Afghanistan was absolutely justified on 9/11. When it happened, I was in New York, and it was immediately clear to me that Al-Qaeda did it. All of us who worked on the Middle East knew immediately they were the only group who could have done it. And we'd worked for years to try to sanction and pressurize the Taliban government in Afghanistan to cease supporting Al-Qaeda. We knew that they were there, and there had been international sanctions to try to force them not to support Al-Qaeda, and it hadn't worked. So I thought it was totally justified.
And Majid, to you, did you feel the attack was justified? Can I ask that in a very sort of blunt way? Did you feel the terror attack had reasons that you understood?
That's what I was actually interested to speak about right now, because I was in Egypt when 9/11 happened, and I was a member of the organisation, the Islamist organisation that I left, that I've since left. The group I belong to is not a terrorist organisation. It does not subscribe to the Al-Qaeda type sort of terrorism, but it certainly subscribes to the same ideology and certainly seeks to seize power through military coups and then conquer the world. So how we reacted to 9/11 was simply to say that the operation itself was the wrong strategy to come to power. But what we were definitely very keen to say to everyone was that the Americans should have realized that their own actions led to this happening inside New York. And that's something which I was speaking to people about in Egypt. I think what we underestimated, when I say we now, I'm talking about people in the West, underestimated was the level of hatred that was out there on the streets of countries like Egypt for American policy. And that's something that's very significant, and it doesn't justify terrorism whatsoever, but it does mean we have to think seriously about foreign policy mistakes that occurred since then that serve to reinforce the Al-Qaeda narrative.
And the war on terror, was it right at the start? Anyone on the panel, would you say the war on terror was the right start?
It was the worst phrase ever concocted. A war on Al-Qaeda, which is what it should have been, and the Taliban, because at that point they were giving them aid and succor. And therefore you set it an objective. War on Al-Qaeda, which John Simpson liberated the country, and it was done. And then it was a question of finding Osama. But by coming up with this concoction, I think you end up with a forever kind of concept that can never, ever end.
I would go beyond, Michael. I would say even a war on Al-Qaeda would be a mistake. But why have a war? Why give these people what they crave? They were criminals, plain and simple. They craved to be holy warriors, and George Bush and Tony Blair gave them that status, and we continue to give them that status today with our military.
Well, I mean, 3,000 people. I mean, this is one of the interesting things about the whole debate, now that we're back at the 10th anniversary, is that, you know, at the time, maybe many people in this audience felt this. I mean, I certainly got it on the air. There was a sense, you know, America had it coming. By the same token, those are 3,000 very real people who are very, very dead, with all of their families in deep mourning. And there has never been an act of terrorism quite like this. And I think that, you know, to go after the perpetrators was probably correct if it had just stopped there.
But it's the way you go.
It's the way you go about
it.
Well, how would you do it then?
Well, it was a criminal act. I mean, to declare war on an idea, to declare war on an abstract, is pointless.
Well, I agree with
It's
that.
like
That's a war on
shooting
terror is a
mosquitoes
bad
with a
idea.
machine gun.
But Al-Qaeda is not an abstract.
Could I perhaps come in and say I think there's a position between these two, because I think that it's dangerous to overstate in terms of military reaction that America did, but also I think it's dangerous to understate it as a criminal act. When we have a political phenomenon out there that aims to strike at the heart of civilian centers for political purposes, it's more than just criminal. Though I agree that America overreacted and invaded countries when it shouldn't have. But I think we need to address this as a civil society phenomenon, not just a criminal act like somebody would mug someone on the street. It's far more than that. And it's actually dangerous to address it as that and condescending to the terrorists and to the non-violent extremists who subscribe to the ideology.
You say condescending to the terrorists, what do you mean?
What I mean by that is that you've got a section that's and the non-violent extremists. You've got a section of people that subscribe to the ideology and vast swaths of populations that sympathize with the narrative. And if you merely categorize many of those grievances and the ideological narrative as a criminal offense, what you're doing is you're dismissing their concerns, you're categorizing them as criminals, and at the same time you're widely off the mark to address what needs to be addressed, which is the grievances, the identity crisis, and the ideology itself.
That's separate to the
and the ideology itself, which must be addressed.
But you can't necessarily identify the crime with the ideology. You said yourself that you didn't support the crime, but you did support the ideology.
So people can be more than criminals, that's the point. People can be more than criminals. They can be they can be people that subscribe to a political ideology and have political objectives. That needs to be addressed.
Isabel, would you just make plain your disagreement, so we can understand, and then we're coming to you? You're saying this is a criminal. Would you just expand on what you...
I'm saying that it was a futile and mistaken response to declare war on terror, and that in the course of declaring war on terror, we junked everything that actually was worth defending. Rule of law, prohibition against torture, we now go for imprisonment without trial, all the things that actually that Western democracy stood for.
This is why we're all here tonight, to discuss these issues, and we're going to discuss the decade now for the next 40 minutes. Would you kindly limit your question to this area?
I just wanted to say something about the phrase about the war on terror, which of course is nebulous and a category error, but I think that was the whole point. You know, given the people who were in charge of American foreign policy at the time, Cheney and others, it gave a license to, you know, attack whoever they wanted using extra-legal means under this kind of nebulous term.
You didn't like the war on terror. What would you have done? Nothing?
Well, it's a very different question. I do think something military had to be done against Al-Qaeda.
Battle on terror.
What is...
I mean, what...
Paddy, can I come in? I appreciate, and you're a journalist, you have to be devil's advocate post-country question, but one of the problems with this debate over the last 10 years has been you either back military action or you want to do nothing. There's no middle ground between the two, and we're trapped in between these extremes.
Well, that's a fair criticism, but I think what was interesting, we all heard Khan say he supported military action in 2001 and then changed his mind. And if we're looking back on a decade, it's honest to say that, and then discuss why we changed our mind.
Yeah,
so what would you have done in 2001? Nothing? You've got the microphone.
I mean, you know, it may be naive to think that a different strategy in Afghanistan with more limited objectives to basically wipe out Al-Qaeda might have succeeded. I can't think of anything better.
Okay, well, it's fair enough, and do come back later. To you up here, and then we're going to move on. Yeah, do go for it.
I was just going to ask the same question. What would an alternative war on terror be like? I mean, no torture, no rendition, no Iraq, presumably.
for this panel, but what would have drained the swamp of Islamic issues?
Khan?
I think that's a really important question, really, really difficult to answer. I thought a lot about it, and it's not just a police response, nor is it necessarily a military response. And the more I thought about it, it's actually about values. It's actually about celebrating values where we are superior to the terrorists. These are values of democracy, of law, of equality, above all the sexes, but of everybody. And embodying those values in our interactions with everybody. This sounds very mealy-mouthed and kind of, wishy-washy and liberal. But actually, it presents an extraordinarily different alternative strategy, which can be enacted by individuals and groups in a way that is ultimately far more convincing and more persuasive and more powerful than any B-2 bomber or drone or anything, because the way we're fighting it now is only going to perpetuate it. I think the fact that we are in a permanent war, whatever we call it, I don't care about the nomenclature, is totally unacceptable. We weren't in a war before, we now are, and maybe my children will be in that war. That's extraordinary.
It's interesting how it morphs. I just want to quickly just put a bit of historical context here. This is the 10th anniversary of 9/11, but it's the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the Balkan Wars. At this time, 20 years ago, the Serbs and the Croats began fighting over the eastern part of Croatia. The violence got out of hand, nothing was done there, and then of course we had the dismemberment of Bosnia, and while that was going on, we had the terror in Rwanda. I bring this up because 9/11 happened on the upward curve of the idealistic moment of humanitarian intervention by the great powers. And you can't discuss the response to 9/11 and even subsequently Iraq without taking into account how many policymakers, and perhaps, Karn, that may be one of the reasons why on September 11th, 2001, you felt that something had to be done. We had watched in that decade of the 90s unspeakable things done, while liberal democracies who had the ability to intervene did nothing. And there was a very strong desire for that. Now, it's got out of, it completely went off the rails because the wrong people were in charge in America, and that's a different question. But I think that the fundamental issue in looking at Afghanistan and at Iraq is, what about the liberal intervention argument when a state is failing and people are being demolished by their own governments?
And the question was there an alternative? Would you like to outline one?
I think there were lots of alternatives. Whether they were all succeeded, I don't know. But that's not the bar. I think, for example, Paddy mentioned earlier the idea that, oh, well, the Taliban weren't going to hand them over. Well, we don't know that. And at the time, in fact, there's a lot of people who would argue that they were. If you go back and look at the records of that period, they wanted evidence. They didn't want to hand them over to the Americans. They would hand them over to an Islamic court. I'm not saying that was acceptable, but we know through people like Bob Woodward and a raft of books over the last 10 years that the Bush administration was never genuinely interested in having him over. I mean, as we all said, pretty much everyone raised their hand, everyone knew on 9/11 there would be war. So why have this pointless debate about extradition when we knew there was going to be war anyway? It seems to be a kind of false debate.
Hi. Point I want to make is I think there is a very obvious response that we could have had, and the sad fact is that it's impossible to implement. We could have done two things. Firstly, bomb the terrorist camps. I've said there's no place for terrorism. Secondly, George Bush has said, Israel, get back inside your 1967 borders, and unless you do so, we will cut off your $6 billion a year in aid. And at that, you could have completely redressed the way that the West has seen to engage with the rest of the world, and that might have been an alternative approach which would have saved a lot of lives.
The first had already been tried. They did bomb the terrorist camps in Afghanistan extensively, and it didn't work.
Okay, I'll just very quickly. What has actually led to the undermining of the jihadist ideology has been none of these actions. What's led to the undermining of their ideology has been primarily efforts in Egypt, in Libya, and other countries by leading jihadists denouncing their previous convictions and then committing themselves to challenging and undermining that narrative. Egypt peaked in the 90s when it comes to terrorism, and it was on a downhill slide since then. The Arab Spring is the culmination of a decade worth of civil society initiatives within Arab societies, and that's what should have been focused on instead of
the suicide notes of the hijackers didn't talk about Israel and Palestine. They talked about the heretics who were running the holy places, the guardians of the holy places. They were talking about the illegitimacy of the Saudi royal family.
Israel has always been on Al-Qaeda.
Sure, no, I don't dispute that at all. But this points to what the necessary response should be. Hang on, the point being that we reacted the wrong way. The right way would have been to support democratization.
Absolutely.
And we're still responding the wrong way today. We are still in bed with Saudi Arabia, which is a repressive human rights abusing regime. It is absolutely clear from Egypt and Tunisia that the Western approach to the Middle East has historically been a total failure. We've been in bed with the wrong people. We need to support democratization across the region, and that includes our own allies.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm ready.
I wanted to, I'm not saying Khan was endorsing this, but there is this myth that Al-Qaeda have nothing to do with Israel. Israel's not irrelevant. According to the 9/11 Commission report, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was going to be the 20th hijacker, planned to land one of his planes. He was going to crash all the other planes, land his plane, and give a speech on US tarmac denouncing US Middle East policy towards Israel and the Middle East. So let's not pretend that Israel has nothing to do with this.
Audience member, hello. Welcome.
On the day of 9/11, I was invited to give an interview in one of the Arabic stations. At that moment, when I came to know about the attack, the first thing came to my mind, which terrified me, that if it had been Palestinians on those planes. Whatever it is, still, I stood by, I was horrified with what happened.
We're on the decade now, we've moved from the day. Would you kindly stick to the panel?
Okay, the point is America and the West would have had gained a lot more had they pursued a different policy, which is democratization and empowering women in particular. There should have been a way of tackling religious leaders, not only bombarding the camps of Al-Qaeda, but religious people, religious clerics who give double meaning in every single speech. And still the way is open, and it is a must and a necessity now to empower women through opening an honest debate about jihad in Islam. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I just want to say that the majority of terrorists, if you look at the founders of most of the Islamist organizations who are non-violent as well, the majority of these people, statistically, come from non-religious backgrounds. Islamist terrorism is not a product of religious Muslims. Islamist terrorism is a product of people like me who are raised liberal secular values and experience a political conversion. That's just a statistical fact. The problem is not in the faith of Islam. The problem was among Muslims. The problem was among Muslims who had a political conversion and adopted Islam in a similar way to what Breivik adopted a Christian narrative, though he was not a practicing Christian. He was not a Christian fundamentalist. He was more akin to a Christianist in that sense. But he adopted that narrative to justify a political doctrine.
Imagine, how do you justify an article which written by Ibrahim Nafeh, from the Egyptian journalist, very well-known person, who said that a question has been put for the audience. If you know of a terrorist going to bombard a place, would you inform? And the answer came that if he's going to target a foreign somebody, I would keep silent about it.
Okay,
you know, that result.
I'm telling you statistically, the majority, I can name them for you, the majority of leaders and founders of Islamist organizations, terrorists and non-terrorists, came from secular backgrounds and had a conversion. I'm one of them.
And to you, and he wouldn't justify it because he left the all over. And to you, and then up to the back, would you stick to the decade now? And then we're going to talk about Iraq in a few minutes.
Yes, I'll definitely stick to the decade since it's a mandate. Just a very quick question for the panel, which I don't think anyone's addressed when we first introduced this discussion, and that is, America had never been invaded, ever, aside from Pearl Harbor, on their own ground. So this was an enormous shock to America to have been invaded with the bombing of the buildings. So the question was this war illegal? And all the questions that we've been raising today is, how should America manage, the leaders of America, the thinkers, the visionaries or the non-visionaries, manage and allay the fears of the average American, 70% of whom still probably do not have a passport, to say, we are going to make you safe? How do you think they should have managed that? What should they have told? What would the message be?
Okay, Michael, Isabel, do you want to tackle that question? And then we'll go to this audience member behind me.
Just quickly, I mean, the question about Americans it goes back to my original statement. I don't think it's the government's job, really, to deal with the psyche of individual Americans. I mean, Americans have grown up in a remarkable society and have been remarkably secure and safe. And I was surprised at how insecure so many people seem to be in the wake of these attacks. And even after the shock went off. In terms of security, you know, there's 850,000 people with top security clearances now in America. Sort of, that's not a very exclusive club anymore. Okay. There's so much money being spent on security. I don't know what else can be done for Americans to suddenly feel relaxed again. But then we get into the economy, which is something else.
But I think the point about the use of fear and the promise of safety in this context is that the course that was chosen has not made America or Americans safer.
And we'll come to that.
It's actually metastasized the problem. And it was simply the wrong approach, but fear was used exactly to justify an agenda that was already there.
Okay.
It's not, yeah, and the fear is the key point, because you asked what they should have done. Now you can say, yes, well, exactly, and that's the point. You can argue that people were fearful, they expected a response. You know, Michael made the point earlier, of course, everyone understood it was 3,000 people dead, the first terrorist attack. But what they did do was make it much, much worse, and they continue to do so. Let's not just put all the blame on George W. Bush. Michael mentioned 850,000 people. This is still ongoing. The national security state under President Obama is spending $75 billion a year on homeland security. Very quickly, the LA Times, just a fortnight ago, did a little survey of some of the homeland security expenditures that are being okayed by various agencies. In Cherry County in Nebraska, they provided thousands of dollars of federal funding to protect cows from biological attack by Al-Qaeda. They provided $750,000 to an anti-terrorist fence around a veterans hospital on a hill outside Charlottesville, North Carolina. I mean, this is the kind of money that's being pumped in to keep people afraid that you could be... Remember the colour-coded homeland security system? This is what we have 10 years on, even under Obama.
They don't have those colour-coded things on.
They did, I'm talking about. That's part of the rampage of fear.
They actually went many years ago.
But that was part of it. I thought we were talking about the decade, Carl, not just now. I made a point now.
You're saying it's continuing now.
Well, I made one point about it's continuing, and I made a point about George Bush and the colour-coded lights. Okay. Do you want to deal with the cows?
Nobody disagrees that about the extraordinary security infrastructure that's been built
and in this country as well,
which is largely opaque and sometimes lawless and totally unaccountable.
Okay, now I'm just going to interrupt. The structure is that we'll talk about Iraq, we're going to come to the future, but I just want to ask, limp through the decade, if you would take the first point from the audience and you'll take the second. Philippa, I think it's you, it's with the microphone.
Well, I just wanted to raise the issue of what else could you have done, because one of the obvious things which has been mentioned is to have a massive diplomatic effort on Israel and the Palestinians on the Middle East. But I was on the streets of New York interviewing people in the days after, and if you said to a lot of members of the American public, now is the time to put massive resources, your resources, into the Middle East, the response of a lot of them would have been, this came out of the Middle East, this carnage, why should we give more? And so it does strike me that it was about the leadership of the political elite. You can't pin it all on Bush. Was there a failure by the elite in general, or the political establishment, to think in a sophisticated manner, a political manner about this?
I just want to say that we've been following a policy for decades of supporting dictatorships and tyrants in the Middle East, such as Mubarak, who subjected me and other people who were with me through torture that was systematic and institutionalized in Egypt, and terrorized its population. And there was a juxtaposition between supporting dictators or supporting extremists. And what the Arab uprisings have demonstrated of late is that there was a third way. And that third way that I keep coming back to is supporting civil society in the Middle East. The masses of the people were democracy aspirants, but they simply didn't have, one, an organization to support them, two, the international community to support them, and three, they were subjected to tyranny by their own rulers and torture that was subjecting them from realizing those aspirations. And finally, I know we're rushing, I want to say one thing, bringing it back to home. One thing we also have to realize, I know I've been focusing a lot on torture and excess, is that I have to say that there is also a problem, just so we don't bury our heads in the sand, among certain elements within Muslim communities who have been in denial about the level of the extremist narrative that has spread among Muslims and the justification for terror. And certain Muslim self-appointed leaders needed to do more to challenge that within their own ranks, and they simply didn't. They simply kept on blaming everything on foreign policy when actually it's not black and white. There is a lot of problems with foreign policy, but also there was a narrative that was justifying this behaviour within Muslim communities that needed to be addressed head-on, and it simply hasn't. And the result of that is some of what we see happening in Pakistan today, where the country is literally in danger of being suffocated by.
Let's keep the discussion going. Will you three have a go, and then back to you in the audience?
Philippa raises a very important point, and I think it's worth trying to analyse what happened in the days after 9/11. Everybody was knocked flat. There was an extraordinary sense of shock in America, and you're quite right that nobody in the political elites, including op-ed writers in the New York Times, was coming up with a plausible strategy about how to deal with it. The reason the Bush administration went with the strategy they did, a military strategy, was that strategy was pre-formed It pre-existed 9/11. It was the neocon strategy of the domino theory of bringing democracy, ironically, to the Middle East, that if you knocked over one, if you knocked over Saddam, for instance, and brought democracy, there would be a knock-on effect to democratize the whole of the Middle East. It was a plausible theory. It was, unfortunately, entirely wrong.
Isabel?
I think we need to sort out what was done for domestic politics in the United States and the objective of any action. And I think there was an enormous disconnect between the results of the action and the domestic political need. 9/11 was above all the most extraordinary piece of theatre. It was, and it demanded an extraordinary piece of theatre in response. Not because that piece of theatre was going to produce anything that was ultimately beneficial, but because that was the demand, that was the domestic political demand. And I think that the administration that was in power helped to create that demand. I mean, they fed it, the question of feeding fear. I mean, this was a spectacular event. They needed a lot of bans. Now, those bans, if you look back at where Al-Qaeda came from, Al-Qaeda came out of 20 years of war in Afghanistan. This was not traditional tribal society. These were displaced people from the camps in Peshawar. This was a product of, if you like, modernity. It wasn't the product of tradition. And they forgot when they were responding that to repeat this cycle was simply going to produce more of it.
Just on the neocon line, I always remember the sentence from Michael Leddy, the neoconservative thinker, who said that every few years the United States needs to take a small, crappy little country and throw it against the wall, just to show who's boss. And I think Afghanistan and Iraq, we're going to come to fit into that narrative, Afghanistan more so because of the attack. Just to do with Philippa's point, look, on the America point, I think we have to be, say something here. I'm married to an American, I love Americans, I spend 2 more holidays a year in America. But we must stop treating the American public like the spoilt children in your family or in your school, where they are exempted to the normal rules that every other country, every other people are dealt with. The idea that because they had a terrorist attack, therefore everything goes out of the window, as if no other country, no other people, no other society has been subjected to a terrorist attack. How many South American and Central American countries have been attacked by terrorists based in Florida? Did they attack in the same way? Northern Ireland, did we send in F-16 jets to respond in that way? I mean, there are countless countries around the world.
These specials, come on, Maggie. This is way off point, I must say.
Really?
Yes. Look, first of all,
well, let's have the argument, then we're coming to you.
Why is it? America is attacked and therefore international rule goes out of the window?
Let him answer.
I'm not going to defend much of American foreign policy during the course of my life. But I will say that this particular case, and we'll come on to other cases after that, and Patty wants to get us on to the other war, the big war of the decade. Al-Qaeda was a non-state actor. Whatever was being hatched in Florida to be sent back to Chile or wherever, or to Central America, was involved in actual political fighting that was going on. Al-Qaeda sent, and it had been building up, let's remember this. They attacked the Cole, that was a small number. They blew up the embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, the same weekend, by the way, as Omagh, because I went to Omagh. And, you know, with each escalation, it did call for a response, and that's the response that came. As for treating Americans like spoiled children, come on, man, if you're married to one, you know it's far too complex a country to make such a grotesque generalization.
No, I'm not making a generalization of Americans, I'm making a generalization of our treatment. We treat as if, the fact that we're having this debate about this terrorist attack, let me deal with this. India, which is the country where my parents come from, was attacked by Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorists, gunmen who went around and murdered. It was a traumatic episode for India. Lots of evidence linking back to Pakistan. America was the first country to urge India not to strike back against Pakistan. Why did the Indian public want to attack Pakistan?
And now to the audience.
It's the law of the jungle if everyone followed the American way.
Local question about domestic foreign policy, I mean UK sort of domestic policy that Majid has partly gestured towards. For all his talk of social cohesion programs, it seems that Tony Blair's response, foreign policy and domestic policy, kind of did very little to galvanise the support of marginalised communities in the UK. And I'm wondering, meanwhile we have David Cameron coming out and making comments about muscular liberalism and all these sorts of things. I'm wondering if you think the UK government has learned anything from its response.
Right, and I'm going to call that question back in a moment. Now what I'm going to do is say, the narrative is, the war in Afghanistan was one thing, the war in Iraq took everyone's eyes into a whole new morass. That's the narrative, and the audience will have a lot to say about that. And I promise to come back to your question about the UK. Can I ask you, Isabel, first, and then to the audience, is that the narrative you sign up to? Khan was in favour of bombing Afghanistan in 2001. He changed his mind.
No, invading it.
Invading it, right. And
invading it nicely.
Probably. And do we think that many people in the world then, once the Iraq War began, this certainty began to unpick? Do you agree with that narrative, Isabel?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole build-up to the war in Iraq was a sort of tissue of rather transparent fabrication. There was no connection. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. You know, everything. I mean, if you were in the region at all, you could see in all the charade of all the diplomacy, they were actually on the ground building air bases. You know, it was going to happen.
Khan, I just spoke for you.
They wanted to do it.
Would you like to say what effect the Iraq will have on you in this decade? What happened to your opinions as you saw it unfold?
Well, it changed my life. I mean, I resigned over the Iraq War. I ended my career as a diplomat. I was our Iraq expert at the UN Security Council. I dealt with the weapons inspections. I'd worked with David Kelly, amongst others, on the WMD issue. And I was staggered by it. I was staggered by the degree of exaggeration. I was in disbelief when the troops went into Iraq. I was in a state of denial for some time. And it was a very upsetting revelation to me that what had happened did take place. So for me, it was an absolute pivot point in my life.
Did you doubt your country in a way you had trusted it before?
Absolutely. It was a very disillusioning experience for me. I really had believed in government diplomacy. I believed in my colleagues in the Foreign Office. It was a very personal thing because I saw those very same colleagues, not very enthusiastically, but nonetheless sign up to what they knew not to be the case. And there are many of them, you know, it was a real breach. I don't speak to many of them now, or some of them don't speak to me.
Can I ask you, is it possible to answer this? Did the hijackers get what they wanted in getting you to have that view? The people who flew the planes, and this lady's begun our evening, is your abject reversal of trust something they wanted to happen to civil society in the West?
I'm not sure that their analysis was that sophisticated. What they wanted to do was actually rouse up the people of the Middle East.
And they got what they wanted.
It was all about the Middle East. There wasn't a thesis of how the West should be transformed.
It's just a very quick. I was in prison among convicted terrorists when Iraq was invaded, and we watched it through newspapers that were smuggled in. And what they did was for Iraq to be invaded.
Yeah,
quite frankly.
absolutely.
And the reason why, the theory was, and I was in prison with the assassins of the former president and among others, very well experienced and trained terrorists. And the theory was, they did have some thought behind it. The theory was provoke America to invade the Middle East, thereby create a mass jihad against American troops. So they actually, with the invasion of Iraq, they got what they wanted. It was a disaster.
But let me just throw something in and apologize to Mehdi by quoting Anil Khan in exactly the way I think he would like it to be quoted. In January 2001, the week of George W. Bush's inauguration, the New Yorker ran a very excellent piece by Nick Lemon speculating on what a Bush foreign policy might look like, because famously he had never been abroad. And most of it was through an interview with Richard Pearl and one or two other neocons. Anyone who read that article could not come away, this is January 2001, come away from thinking that this first term of the president's term in office would not see an invasion of Iraq. It was all laid out there. And that theory, that bizarre theory, that by forcing people to democratize at the point of a gun or by dropping Tomahawk missiles would work. And I have to say that war would have happened if I'm absolutely certain.
That's absolutely not right. Inside the US and British governments at that time, we knew perfectly well that the neocons had that agenda, that people like Pearl and Wolfowitz wanted to invade Iraq. But we were told very firmly by the White House and indeed by the NSC and above all by state, of course, that they were marginalised, that thesis, that concept, that argument...
Doesn't make it true though, Carl.
No,
I told you
hang on, but 9/11, of course, changed everything. We all knew that 9/11 was not related to Iraq, but it changed the mood so much in Washington that suddenly an invasion of Iraq became plausible.
Okay, finish. No, I just was going to say, okay, but my question, because you would know, is that the timelines we've seen in the Woodward books and other things indicate that Tony Blair went over straight away, first person to get into U.S. airspace, after the bin Laden family got out of U.S. airspace, and almost immediately gave his bona fides that they would go forward. And this was only like 72, 96 hours later.
We would not have done it without 9/11. British policy before 9/11 was absolutely emphatic from number 10 downwards, that we could not invade Iraq just because it was a bad thing. There was a belief in containment. Containment was working, Iraq was not a threat. That was the absolute solid core belief of the British government. The policy was in fact working. We thought the neocons were wrong. There was an analysis in the Foreign Office that we thought that the invasion of Iraq would spark civil war in Iraq. And that view, that policy view, was held from the top downwards.
So we're going to have all the panel's view on Iraq and then back to the audience on Iraq. So would you start, Mehdi, you haven't spoken yet.
Look, I think it's very hard to make predictions counterfactual as to what would have happened. I've stopped making predictions since Nick Clegg became Deputy Prime Minister. But on that subject, I'm probably closer to Michael than to Khan. I think given what we know about some of those individuals, they would have found a way to engineer a war with Iraq. And I think, I remember Jack, you're talking about before 9/11, what the British government was being told. After 9/11, let's not forget, Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary, went on the Today programme and said Richard Pearl is an irrelevant figure, we're not invading Iraq, we're only invading Afghanistan, Iraq is not on the agenda. So I'm not saying that there was any falsehood on the part of the British government at that stage, but perhaps that's what they believed, who knows what the British government believed, but we know what certain factions inside the US government believed. Iraq didn't change my life like it changed Khan's life, but it certainly is the most profound political moment of my life. And for me, it was a moment of great, deep disillusionment and a disconnection from the Labour Party, which I had hitherto supported up until that point. And I was one of those people, I don't know how many people in this room who marched in February 2003 and basically came away, you know, I'm a political journalist. I don't know how I'm a political journalist, because I came away thinking politics is a waste of time. Here we are, the masses of people around the world protesting, masses of people well aware that this is a war based on lies, masses of people well aware that the Joint Intelligence Committee, we didn't need a Joint Intelligence Committee to tell us that invading Iraq would increase the terrorist threat and bring bombs to London, and yet it happened anyway. It was a deeply, deeply depressing event.
Yes, hello. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former intelligence analyst with Customs and Excise, and I wrote a report on revenue matters in the UK, not terrorism or anything, in late 2001, after 9/11, stating that the US would invade Iraq in late 2002 or 2003, which, let's face it, I think many people had that view, and we've heard comments here. My question is, how much attention has been given in your discussions with informed people about why, even putting aside the issues of Iraq, whether invading or not, is why there was no effective preparation for it afterwards? Because I think going forward for where we go next, that's a very big question. I mean, that really does seem gross incompetence.
I think, well, it was a combination of hubris and ignorance, if you look back at what we now know, and it does relate, as you say, to Libya, what's going on in Libya. A lot of us are worried because of the lessons of Iraq. People keep saying we've learned the lessons.
But we haven't occupied Libya, it's slightly different.
No, exactly, but in terms of what, I'm not talking about reconstruction, I'm talking about our knowledge of the region, our knowledge of that country. I mean, let's not forget, I think it's, I can't remember the name, Peter Galbraith, who was our ambassador, UN ambassador for Clinton, I think, I can't remember what diplomatic role he held. He famously took a group of Kurds, he was very involved in the Kurdish movement, to see George W. Bush in January 2003, at which meeting George Bush revealed he did not know the difference between Sunnis and Shias, did not even understand the Sunni-Shia division in Iraq. A similar group of experts went to see Blair in November 2002, Toby Dodge and others, and at the end of the meeting where they talked about Iraq's tribes, history, sectarianism, at the end of the meeting Blair leaned forward and said, but Saddam's evil, isn't he? And this was unfortunate, the attitude of a lot of some of the clever people we elected.
One of the problems was that we still, in many cases, domestically as well as in foreign policy, we're still doing it, is we were relying on the analysis of individuals who had appointed themselves as representative of the people. Okay. So in Iraq's case, Ahmad Chalabi managed to sway the American administration into believing that, first of all, he was a popular leader, and second of all, that the people would be behind such an action. And I think that the lesson to learn from that is domestically and in foreign policy, we must stop propping up umbrella organizations and individuals who subscribe to a form of communalism and claim to speak on behalf of communities. There is no such thing as the Muslim community.
No.
There are Muslim
Well,
communities.
all these lessons, I promised to let you give us some lessons in the future, but he said, why was there no preparation?
Well, one reason there was no preparation was that there was a sort of coup inside the intelligence services in the United States. That inconvenient news was kept out of the process. The experts were delivering inconvenient news. The experts in post-conflict reconstruction were trying to make plans, and they were excluded from the process because people like Ahmed Chalabi were feeding a line that was far more consistent with an ideologically driven agenda.
And to you at the back, and if you want to catch our eye up there on Iraq, then we're going to move on.
Second gentleman from the right, what's your name?
Michael.
What's your name?
Michael Goldfarb.
Michael, you raised some very good points about the failure of the U.S. to actually understand and strategize the human terrain when looking at the war on terror. So what I want to ask you is, if you were the United States government, what specific propaganda efforts would you have engaged in to more effectively combat extremist ideology in the human terrain?
Right, now that's a question that everyone wants to answer, but not now. So, it's a very fair question, and I'm going to come to it. But on Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, has anyone not been heard who wants to take the discussion in new ways? You had a question earlier. I'll come back to you in a second. Oh, right, go on.
Debate's moved on a little bit, but I'd like to kind of add to Michael's point about the inevitability of some war by the US administration. Paul O'Neill, Bush's first Treasury Secretary, wrote a book in which he describes a cabinet meeting in which it was viewed that there would inevitably be proliferation of nuclear weapons throughout the world, basically, and they had to make some example of a country that could be knocked out to avoid this, and Iraq was the obvious candidate.
Okay, that's your point. Yours?
Yeah, Isabel mentioned there was almost coup within the US intelligence agencies. Did the same apply to the UK intelligence agencies as well?
No, the Joint Intelligence Committee sent a memo to Tony Blair in February 2003 saying that invading Iraq will heighten the threat from Al-Qaeda and will exacerbate the idea of them obtaining weapons-grade materials. Tony Blair saw that memo and ignored it and didn't tell the rest of the
facts. Subsequent intelligence documents moved towards war.
I can't hear you, sorry.
Would you like to repeat it?
Yeah. Having said that, why therefore did further information from the intelligence agencies push us to war and conflict?
It's a really complicated process, and I think it's been mischaracterized in public as the manufacture of a lie. I don't think it was that simple. There was a process whereby internal assessments were edited and re-edited at the instruction of number 10. I gather it was Alistair Campbell. David Kelly told me it was Alistair Campbell who did this when he and I discussed it. That process of re-editing the intelligence ended up by turning what was uncertain into certainty, what was black into white. I'll give you an example. For many years when we talked about Iraq at the UN, we said that Iraq had up to 12 dismantled Scud missiles. In the dossier, the number 10 dossier, that came a belief that Iraq had 20 Scud missiles. So you can see how a deficit, a lack of understanding of our knowledge was turned into a positive statement about the threat. And that was a universal process. It went through the GISC, and I think certain heads of institutions who should have known better went along with it against the advice of their juniors.
But how is that different from the construction of a lie? It's done to political direction. It's misusing information.
Sure. I'm just trying to articulate what actually happened and not necessarily name it as something.
Okay. And to you?
So it's a very quick technical interjection. Is that you mentioned how the neocons idea had been totally marginalised. It wasn't in British foreign policy interest at all about changing Iraq. But was it under Clinton that the regime change bill had been passed by the Senate?
That's right. It was passed under Clinton, and during the UK US-Iraq talks, which were quarterly, we had a big bilateral session where we'd go to states, sometimes they'd come to London, and all the Iraq teams would sit and talk to each other. And the State Department asked us to raise regime change, to put it on the agenda. And the reason they asked us to put it on the agenda of those talks was because they wanted us to say very clearly that we did not support regime change.
Okay.
So it's an important point, we went along with this charade by raising the point. Our Middle East director would say, we don't like regime change, we don't agree with it. So all the State Department officials could write this down and report this to the White House that the Brits did not support regime change. And we had a whole list of reasons why we didn't support it.
I'm taking the discussion just in the interest of time. I'll give you time. There's half an hour left. We're trying to go through the lessons of the decade. We've reached Iraq, and then we've got to move to the future and the points raised by you about what narrative could have been given, and you about what's happening in the US and in the UK. But we're still on the Iraq war, and you've got the microphone, then you have.
I just wonder, was there ever a good national interest case for the war in Iraq? Because it was always presented as being woolly liberals don't want to hurt anyone, but we're the sort of sober, pragmatic, we're doing this for a deal in the future. I remember Una King saying, oh, we're going to get progress with Israel if we go along with Iraq. And that always seemed like, to me, the more naive point to make. And now it seems that the national interest case has never been really critically examined.
If I could just jump in on that. There's, first point, I want to go back to the point I made about the 20-year arc of liberal intervention, which is now basically been buried by the failures in Iraq and the continued failure in Afghanistan. And remember that Tony Blair in 2002 was roughly 5 years, and 6 years into his term. And his whole experience had been, you bring in the Americans and they close the deal in Northern Ireland. You go into West Africa and you can shut down bloodshed. And you join the Americans, you bomb Belgrade, and you get rid of Milosevic. So in a sense, I mean, I think, I suspect that behind, the image today is always, you know, Mr. Christie is crazy and whatever. There was probably at the core some idea that he had learned those lessons. Unfortunately, he learned them too well. The lesson he didn't learn, and this is the point I've been trying to make, and a number of people brought this up, is, guys, you don't get what junior partner means when you go to war with the United States. To think that anything that Britain had to say about the utter chaos and craziness that was from day one evident the minute Saddam's statue came down in Baghdad. I happened to be in the north of the country that day, but I got to Baghdad several days later. It was very, very insane. I was in Mosul the day the regime collapsed. There was no plan. There was nothing. They sent Petraeus from the south of the 101st because it was going to erupt into some, Mad Max situation. I am certain, I know that the Foreign Office was concerned, and yet none of those concerns were met in any way by the Americans. Okay. And I think it's a really important thing to understand and remember.
Mehdi and Khan?
Just one thing on Iraq, which is so depressing, is the way that for years a lot of the hawks, after all went wrong, tried to get us to move along, and for various reasons we didn't move along, whether it was David Kelly's death, whether it was the sectarian war in 2006, we carried on focus on it, and Afghanistan was forgotten, and it was called the Forgotten War. And now it kind of has switched, where Afghanistan is the war we worry about in Iraq, but we've almost forgotten about when, 2 weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, 100 people were killed in suicide bombs, car bombs and sniping across the country. There is still massive violence and killing on a much lower level than before. But, unfortunately, Saddam Hussein was a disgusting, genocidal tyrant. But by toppling him, we talk about terrorism and 9/11, we brought massive terrorism to that country. We enabled terrorists to destroy hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives, innumerable lives.
I think one of the most gross failures of the Blair government in organising and agreeing to the Iraq invasion was that they failed to consider alternatives. Under just war theory, war should be the last alternative that you resort to. And there was a reasonable alternative to war that's never talked about, which involved much more vigorously targeting the illegal revenues that sustained the Saddam regime. I and various other US officials sought repeatedly to persuade our ministers that this was a way to undermine the Saddam regime from within, because these were the funds that sustained his power, that financed, for instance, the Republican Guard. And that policy option was never adopted. It was never even considered. There was no record of a cabinet discussion where any minister, any one of them, said, is there an alternative to war? It's an absolute disgrace that they didn't consider that.
And to you there?
Putting aside the debate about the justification for war in Iraq, or the lack of, we are where we are. Does the panel believe that the people of Iraq have a brighter future now, or a bleaker future now, than they did on September 10th, 2001?
I can't answer that question, it's for them.
wouldn't think it's looking very pretty, either in Iraq or in Afghanistan, frankly. I think there's a long way to go. Can I just say something about the mystery as to why Tony Blair did what he did? Because it's still, I find it still intriguing, and I absolutely what Michael said. I think
yes, but can I just ask, is anyone on the panel going to answer this question? I'll come straight back to you. That life's better for Iraqis today than it was when Saddam was gassing them. Do you want to tackle that?
He was gassing the Kurds.
That's a loaded question. Well, that's the question. What's the answer?
I think that depending on which standard you're using, if you're talking about security, then no. If you're talking about perhaps political rights, then yes, it's complicated and it's hypothetical. What should have happened is what happened in Egypt, what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Libya, where the people demanded the change themselves. What shouldn't have happened is where it was forced on them through military action.
I hope and pray they have a brighter future, but what really annoys me is when a lot of people take these polls and they say, we've done polls of the Iraqi public and they supported the war. I say, how many of the dead people have you polled for their views?
Isabel, I interrupted you. Would you continue with the point you were making? I'm sorry.
Why did Tony Blair do what he did? And I think that what Michael said, I agree with, and I think that at that point it seems very distant now. But there was a meeting with the King of Jordan and Tony Blair with Bush in the early days, and they said, it was in the days when Bush said, you know, you're either with us or against us. And I think that Blair's real ambition, having brought peace to Northern Ireland, was to bring peace to the Middle East. And both the King of Jordan and Blair said to Bush, we will support you on Iraq on condition that, you know, there is a parallel diplomacy over Israel and Palestine, which of course never happened. Now you may think that was an extraordinarily naive thing, but I think it was a kind of road to hell, if you like, that at that point he thought the only way to bring peace in Israel and Palestine was to hang on to the ankles of Bush.
Now, can I suggest we go to the question that you kindly raised earlier about life in our own country? You can keep the microphone for a moment, but you'll come up. Can you turn your attention to a decade in the US and the UK? You mentioned Islamophobia. We know you've mentioned a surveillance state and a top secret, and you've mentioned radicalisation. Would you all, in the panel and audience, address, in the decade, what happened in the US or the UK that's the biggest change that we should discuss? Would you start, Michael?
It's not really off topic. I think that the crash of 2008, in terms of its capability to change the society, I think it already changed, but to make it worse, it far exceeds the terrible, terrible carnage of 10 years ago.
You mean, sorry, the subprime mortgage crisis?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole irony of this discussion. And as it's got worse, you know, was it Martin Wolf pointed out, we're not in a double-dip recession, we never got out of the first one. Only by that one single measure of, 2 quarters of negative growth have we got out of recession. This is what is destroying American society. The fact that 16% of the population is unemployed. The headline figure is 9.2. Don't believe it. Go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Every month, they do a really good survey. 16% of the American working age population who wants to work has no work. Another 4 or 5% are people, who've been turned into freelancers. That is the most important thing that's happened.
Will you address radicalisation?
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. That though that's relevant, and I'm not disputing it, you can't deny that you do need a policy to address domestic radicalisation if it exists. And I think
that was that question up there.
I thought we were talking about that. No, I think we're talking about that one there. So I think what we made the same mistake that we made in foreign policy, that we focused on the top down rather than the bottom up. What I mean by that is that Prevent One, i.e. the first version of the strategy to tackle radicalisation, invested in and supported these self-appointed leaders, something I was mentioning earlier, who claimed to represent the Muslim street and the Muslim voice, as if the Muslim community was one homogenous bloc, which it isn't, fact. Government were funding organisations that sympathised with the extremist narrative and in some cases with the terrorist narrative, and they were treating Muslims like a fifth column within their own countries because they were engaging with interlocutors who were in many cases self-appointed, akin to when people turned up in the new continent in America and said, bring me your chief, bring me your leader, when actually these should be treated as citizens of the country with, who are to be engaged with through their political representatives in Parliament. I think a lot has changed, the debate has moved on. The new strategy that was asked about there has decided to abandon this approach of treating Muslims like a fifth column within the country by going through these self-appointed leaders, but rather has decided to not subsidise and support people that espouse the extremist narrative and justify terrorism, just as government wouldn't subsidise people who espouse racism. It's just, just wrong. And has decided to try and genuinely empower grassroots voices. Now, it still isn't spot on, it isn't 100%. There is progress, but I would take issue with anyone who tries to claim that because of all these other problems, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, just as a point of caution, that because of all these other problems that we don't need a policy to address domestic radicalization. Of course we do. There are convicted terrorists in prison, some of you might know, in British prisons, who try to blow up things in the UK. So we do need a policy to address it.
Khan, what happened in the UK that's the biggest change in 10 years?
I'd much rather talk about the US because that's where I spent most of the last 10 years. And the two extraordinary things, Michael's absolutely right. The crisis in America today is economic, and it's a real crisis. There's a real sense of something that politicians cannot resolve. But the change that is directly attributable to 9/11 is the fact that the American people have been acclimatized to a permanent war, which is extraordinary. And it remains true in America today that politicians from left and right have poisonous disputes. I mean, the political acrimony in America is extremely toxic. But the one thing politicians cannot touch, and which they're all required to respect, is the budget for Homeland Security and the core elements of military spending. That is absolutely sacrosanct. No politician can question that extraordinary amount of spending. The only politician who's questioning that spending is Ron Paul from the Libertarian right.
Isabel, would you address...
Who's also the only politician to stand up for Bradley Manning.
I suppose domestically, well, I think both in the UK and the US, one of the important results has been the failure of politics, if you like. The disillusionment in Western democracies with their own political processes, the failure to, the war and everything that derived from it, and which has been accompanied by a growth of grassroots extremism and populism, very strong in the United States, but very strong all over Europe.
I recently went to interview Tariq Jahan, whose son was killed in the riots. And outside the house, there's a little group of young Asian men, young British Muslim men of Pakistani origin, who were crowded around the house. And one of them said to me as I was leaving, he said, "This guy, I love him." I said, "Why do you love him?" Because I love him not just because of what he did and how honourable he was and noble he was, but I look at him now on TV and radio. He's the first Muslim I can see on television or radio who's not dismissed as a terrorist, an extremist, radical, and militant, and fiscal, whatever it is. Oh, no. Me and you, Majid, we have a long way to go. And for me, that crystallised a moment that for 10 years now, from 9/11, and in particular from 7/7 in Britain, there has been this case now where the political and media elites have totally underestimated and almost turned a blind eye to what has happened to the representation, the treatment of Muslims. You look at the Norway attack, disgusting, but you had the European Home Affairs Commissioner saying this is a wake-up call to European elites.
So can I ask you to describe that further? Tariq Jahan was like relief, love, satisfaction that any positive Muslim role model was being heard in our media. Was it a strong, overwhelming force?
It was overwhelming for every Muslim I met. That was their second reaction. The first response was, what an amazing guy, how he responded to that tragedy. The second response was, oh my God, a Muslim we can look up to, who's a role model, who's an inspiration, who non-Muslims are looking at positively.
It's important to mention, Tariq Jahan also used to belong to the same group that I did. So he also went through a journey. Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Right.
He used to be an Islamist extremist. So, wait, it's important to mention this because a journey since the last decade has been undertaken by Muslims within this country. If you'd spoken to him 10 years ago, he would have had a very different thing to say.
So this is important. The contrast that we're saying in the decade is there was Islamophobia growing in our country in this 10 years. Is that do you agree with?
What's happening is extremisms across the board, both on the Muslim side and the far-right fascist side, have been on the rise, but what's also been on the rise is community voices are beginning to challenge that.
But the difference
More of that needs to be done, and Tariq is one example of that.
With terror, the difference is, we talk about the hijackers having hijacked Islam, and a lot of Muslims use that phrase, but a lot of warriors on terror have hijacked the tragedy of 9/11 to push their own agendas when it comes to Muslim minorities, whether it's the headscarf, whether it's marriage, whether it's halal meat. Everything is now rolled into the war on terror and this supposed clash of civilizations.
And this is in the section what's happened in our own country in 10 years. You and then you.
I was going to talk about Iraq, but it's moving so fast I don't know where I am.
Can
I just say that I have interviewed militants on the Afghan-Pakistan border, and believe you me, in the years following Iraq, the #1 cause for those people who joined militant outfits was Iraq. they considered it to be an opportunistic criminal invasion, which then resulted in even worse, with things like, you know, Abu Ghraib and rendition and so on.
In our own country, did it radicalise people? Would you address that? Because we're on that
in the
section
UK.
now. In the UK.
Quite possibly. I haven't actually interviewed people in the UK, but I can only tell you that the ones that I did interview talked very much about double standards and the fact that what happened after 9/11 was that the West tried to avenge the death of 3,000 people by killing many thousands more.
Do you? About the UK we're on now.
Well, I was going to talk about the United States.
You can talk about the United States as well, that's fine. We're on the domestic impacts in the US and the UK.
Perfect. Well, as an American, what I've noticed, and Isabel mentioned it earlier, is there's a bit of a marginalization of, like, and it stems with the Bush administration that he didn't even move the majority of the vote. They found the people that they needed to get the votes to then win, whether that was, you know, the majority or not. So, and then there's also like a large amount of fiscal responsibility that, you know, engaging in conflicts that we can't afford that led to like the housing crisis. And my question was, is there a similar like correlation in the UK? Because I'm new to the UK, but after 8 years of marginalizing groups, whether you're, you know, a religious ideology or an ethnic group, and then spending without concern for budgets, it's left America in a pretty disastrous situation right now. And is that similar in the UK at all?
So war spending has deprived the society. I think that's the point of the gentleman. Do you think that war spending has deprived UK citizens?
Well, yeah, I'm sure we could all think of better ways to spend money.
So now we're going to just
we're spending £4 billion this year in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
We're taking questions about the UK, then we're going to move on to the future about, which is one of the questions that we've got. You've had a question already, but you're going to make this one better.
Very similar, actually.
Okay, it was very good the last time.
An alternative war on terror at home, what would that look like? You mentioned soft power from the ground up and so on. But would any of the panel keep any of the sort of hard power measures, as in, you know, TPIM, scrim, you know, whatever they're called now, but, you know, control orders, curtailment of civil liberties?
Would you be kind enough to answer your own question? I don't mean to be flippant with you. Do you believe there is a need for them?
I think there is an element for sophisticated sort of hard power response, but I don't know what that is, because all the ones we have seem to be counterproductive. So what would that look like?
I think to understand the problem correctly will indicate what should have been done. Then there are terrorists who break the law, and therefore the police and the law enforcement agencies need to chase them down, arrest them, and put them on trial. But at the same time, if terrorism, and the very reason we object to it is because it undermines the rule of law, then in our response, it's counterproductive to the communities we are trying to bring on board to also undermine the rule of law. What I mean by that is rendition, what I mean by that is stop and search, what I mean by that is control orders, profiling at airports, and all of the measures that were taken that are in excess of the law were counterproductive. But if you mean by hard measures, arresting and putting terrorists on trial, then of course, no one's in dispute of that. But what was missed was that terrorism is at the top of the tree of a narrative that exists below it, and it was the same in Northern Ireland. And that narrative fuels the terrorists. It makes them feel that they are part of the community. And more needed to be done to address the narrative and the very falsifications that were part of that narrative on the grassroots. And simply more needs to be done right now because it isn't being addressed.
Okay, now let's move to your predictions. Isabel, were we looking the wrong way? We've launched 2 wars, we're involved in Libya. Have we missed something?
Well, we've missed quite a lot. I mean, there's been quite a lot going on outside this rather narrow, hard, military agenda. I think that the thing that the last decade has done is demonstrate the limitations of that, the limitations of projecting lethal force in pursuit of a policy. And since that was the United States' chosen objective, the United States has ended this decade infinitely weaker than it began. And in the meantime, over in Asia, people have been quietly getting on with huge growth, securing diminishing resources, dominating markets that the United States used to dominate, and using a diplomacy which is not particularly Western friendly. And I think that the conduct of the war on terror has undermined any discourse on human rights that we could have with China, for instance. We have no moral standing whatsoever to talk human rights in China. So we've set back that cause.
Yeah. Do go on. I want to ask you, China's your areas of expertise. In this decade, which we've all come to discuss, has China moved more in a more muscular direction as a political
Absolutely.
player?
China's had a decade of extremely muscular nationalism in which all of China's ills are blamed on the outside, coupled with, and by the way, China's back in her rightful place in the world, and we have no obligation whatsoever to listen to you. And that's where China has moved. We have created that opportunity.
It's a very interesting point. Two things. If I say the name Robert Mugabe, will everybody boo and hiss? Probably yes. China sells the Mugabe regime its repressive equipment, its listening devices and a whole bunch of other stuff. How do you deal with that question? The second thing, and this is a question that I'm glad to be able to ask Isabel. Just south, I think southeast, could be southwest, 70 kilometers from Kabul is the world's largest copper mine. It is being developed by the Chinese on a special deal they've cut with Hamid Karzai. They provide no security in Afghanistan. They get a sweetheart deal. They get the road, they're building the roads, Chinese engineers are out there. American troops are running around being shot at while the Chinese scoop out the largest copper deposits on Earth. How long do you reckon that's going to continue?
It makes sense to the Chinese, I can tell you.
Can I add a question to you as well? Of course, Isabel, you're the specialist on China here, and I think that my question to add to Michael's would be that has this last decade, sorry to take over the role of chair,
you're doing it very
has this last decade, have we missed the evolution of China from an economic power to an aggressive political power that's seeking empire, linked to this point? Because I think that what I believe we've actually underestimated is the extent of Chinese investments in Africa. The fact that Pakistan last week announced that Chinese is going to be compulsory for school children to learn. This pointed investment in Afghanistan. And what implication will that have on the world as we know it?
Well, this comes back to the question of what is power and what is influence and what is security. It seems to me that the real existential security threats over the next 20 years are not terrorism. They're water shortage, food prices, food shortages, population, climate change. These are existential threats to societies, that are currently prosperous. And if you look at how powers are maneuvering to deal with that future, China is securing resources. It's securing land in Africa to grow food. It's doing deals with on minerals all over the place. It's floating a lot of economic boats. It's now the biggest trading partner in Latin America. Latin American prosperity is on the China trade. It's prosperity without development because it's like the Manchester trade. You export cheap goods, you import raw materials. So it's not an, if you think of seeking empire as the 19th century mode of seeking empire or the American mode of seeking empire, no, it's different.
Right.
But it is about economic power, it is about securing resources, it's letting other people get along with the security agenda, which China does not yet do.
So can I just ask Mehdi on this, we've all come in to answer this question as well, how the events of 10 years ago have shaped our world and will continue to do so. Have they shaped it by putting the US and UK into expensive and tragic wars? Yeah. And China has been running around with a large mop, taking business and hard power and soft power.
Well, 2 points perhaps contradictory. Let's not exaggerate how badly America is doing. America's done. That's a sweeping, not America, but factions within America have done very well out of these wars as well, and out of deals, out of contracts, out of resources as well. It's not just the Chinese plundering everything. And we talk about arms deals. I mean, Michael mentioned China selling to Mugabe. Let's not even get started how much America and Britain sell to Saudi Arabia and others around the world as well. So we do very well out of the arms trade to dodgy people as well. On the subject of what have we squandered, I mean, coming back to the original point, the original question about the day and that moment. Let's not forget, that was a moment where the anti-American French woke up and said, we are all Americans now. That was a moment where Iranians, who regarded America as a great Satan, came out of their homes with candle, and the mayor of Tehran rang Giuliani to give condolences. That was a moment where America could have exercised not just political leadership, but moral leadership in the world. And 10 years later, America has lost its moral high ground, if it ever had any, and has squandered $4 trillion along the way, if you believe the Brown University study a few months ago. And then we have this crisis over debt and deficits and defaults. And of course China is going to benefit from that, but not just China, there's countless other countries in Asia and Africa, and you could argue in Europe, that are going to benefit from that.
I think it's easy to exaggerate the extent of the loss of American power. America still is an extraordinarily important political power globally. I have worked very closely on the independence of South Sudan. South Sudan is one of our clients, and on that process, the US was extraordinarily important in moulding the process and pulling the international community along to accept the separation of South Sudan and its independence. And on the Libya intervention, the French-UK intervention led by them was not plausible until the US decided to come in behind them. And there's a UN Security Council, the Brits and the French were shuffling around with drafts weeks before the resolutions were actually passed, and the decisive factor was the US pulling the rest of the world along with them, taking, for instance, a South African ambassador round the shoulder and saying, please, mate, you're going to vote our way, aren't you? And the Chinese don't yet do that. They haven't learned that skill of dominating the world politically as well as economically.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, Mike, I'm trying to get back to the original question. I think that, because it's easy to be glib about America. Like I said, it's a very complex place, and American power. I think that the current economic crisis, though, is very profound. I don't necessarily buy into the complete causality, the single cause of funding two wars by cutting taxes, although it's created a huge hole in the public finances. I think there's a deeper problem at work, not just in America, but in the UK and throughout the traditional global economic powers, the ones that China seeks to supplant. And that is, it's clear to me that the global capitalism has run out of puff when it comes to creating enough employment for the citizens of these countries and allowing them to live. And that has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And we have to, the more I listen to this conversation, which has been great, I feel what I started to feel when I was in Iraq, which is, you know, that was a terrible event on September 11th, but it was in and of itself. And that much of what's happening now was already in train before that. And as we memorialize that event, I think it would be wrong to ascribe too much of the state of the modern world to the fact that Osama had this one spectacular success and then spent a decade in hiding, waiting to be executed.
Can I turn that to the audience? Thank you for that, Michael. Could I ask you to answer this question? It's everywhere this week. Was 9/11 the day that changed the world? It changed everything. I think we've all heard that. Would you put your hand up if you believe 9/11 changed everything? So it's about a third of the room. Changed everything, yes? You think that as well. Michael, those people disagree with you.
It's a democracy still.
Good panel, would you prepare your closing thoughts, things that you wish you'd said, things that came out wrong, things you want to have a go at me